This was a law that was enacted in the early 1900s that basically enabled the National Guard to be formed, but it also is very stringent as far as its supporting of the Second Amendment and individual gun ownership rights. It basically has the strength to trump anything that's been passed recently, and it basically says that there's no such thing as gun control legislation. You can't have it. Now, as long as people are willing to go along with this crap, that's fine, but the Dick Law, or the Dick Act, is still in force. It is still the law of the land. And that is just one more thing that very easily could be brought up and mentioned as far as when you want to challenge what people are trying to do with gun control legislation. As far as other things that the government may or may not be up to in companies that provide us certain services and our expectations towards them being probably not high enough, according to the website darkpolitricks.com, that is darkpolitricks.com, not politics, politricks. According to a report that they've recently released, Facebook is in the midst of purging several pro-gun posting and actually pro-gun accounts. If you create an account for a pro-gun organization, supposedly they're dumping you. If you look at the bigger picture, you can find many ways in which the government's involved in the internet. Facebook's just one of those cyber firms that the government may be able to influence. Also, according to the report, they list other examples of censorship over at the examiner.com, that is examiner.com. But the report continues that Facebook is closing pro-gun accounts, patriotic sites, and anti-Obama posts, insinuating that the administration itself is putting the pressure on them to get them to do that. And supposedly there are, and I quote, "There are so many wrongful and destructive tools in the forms of laws, regulations, and actions taken by recent administrations, especially the current one. They then challenge you to become an activist, stop the invasion that's trying to destroy us, address issues, take corrective action when you can, and don't view yourself as helpless. You are in reality part of a growing army of patriots who refuse to allow the bloodshed of the founding of the United States of America to have been spilled in vain. Need to build banks of information, try to expose everything that is happening, and those who are doing it to the country, even if it's coming from within the country." They continue their patriotic fervor by saying that if we don't take action now to turn the ship around, then we will all have failed. And it will become merely an account of how we lost the greatest country in history. Then it asks for suggestions of things that you can do about Facebook becoming another, quote, big brother. I find that interesting in so much as you get a little bit of conspiracy theory thrown in there, which, tapping to the truth's not above looking at what facts may or may not be involved with any particular conspiracy theory. In fact, I fully intend to have some specific conspiracy theory related broadcast upcoming. But you also have this call to action by someone who feels extremely patriotic, and they're trying to pursue you. This is becoming more and more common, that it would lead you to believe that there is a strong contingent of people that are dissatisfied with what our government's doing it. Well, why not? We have a floundering economy. We have a government that can't handle even putting a budget together, let alone trying to avoid the fiscal cliff. Let's start with some basic truths. Number one, our culture has accepted two huge lies. The first one is that if you disagree with somebody's lifestyle, you must fear or hate them. And the second is that to love someone means that you agree with everything they believe or do. Both are complete and total nonsense. Any parent can tell you you love your kid even though you don't necessarily love everything your kid does. You don't have to you don't have to compromise convictions to be compassionate. You don't have to give up on a stance of we need to be fiscally responsible in order to still care what happens to somebody who needs economic help and assistance. The media, along with the so-called progressives, have done an excellent job of pushing the idea that if you stand opposed to whatever new spending program they're offering today, whether it's for the children or for the elderly or for the whoever, the whole idea that if you oppose it based on financial reasons, mainly we don't want to have to raise taxes in order to pay for some new spending, then somehow you're against these people. You don't like children. And way too often conservatives have capitulated without fully reading whatever the law may be and actually taking a full look at what the ramifications might possibly be that go along with it by saying, well, you know what, I don't want to be seen as being against the children. And it would be far easier for them to go out and say, see, he's against kids, than it would be for me to explain why I'm not against kids. It's time to stand up and really start telling people the truth. And that is, I oppose this for this reason. We can't afford it. Period. Conservatives have done constantly a terrible job, for the most part, in expressing why they have the views they have and why they vote the way they do. And more often than not, since several of them feel like they can't win the argument because they don't want to be painted a certain way, they don't even stand up for the principle. We've got to get back to standing up for principles. You know, just as a point of reference, this fiscal cliff nonsense that's coming up, you know, today is the day they're supposed to be having a couple of new votes, and I'm sorry. I predicted a while back that this is exactly what they would do because, quite honestly, I feel like they already knew what they were going to do. They already knew what they wanted to do. They already knew what they could and couldn't do. And they just want to be seen as working really hard at the very last minute so that they can make an excuse for why certain things are in it and certain things aren't in it. It's been nearly a full year since the legislation was put in place that would enact the mandatory changes that are upcoming. I mean, it's just insane that people want to try and convince you right now that they've been working really hard for the last 2 weeks to come up with for a solution for a topic that they've had more than a year to work on. It's even more insane for them to insist that they've been trying really hard when they haven't even attempted to pass a budget. Brings me back to my point of the last few shows of we need a balanced budget amendment put into the Constitution requiring it to be put in place. It must be there, and there has to be real ramifications of what will happen to the individuals that do not make it happen. If that was put in place, it would happen. We wouldn't have to worry about fiscal cliffs. We wouldn't have to worry about raising the debt ceiling. And that argument is going to come as soon as they finish with this. For crying out loud, Nancy frickin' Pelosi just recently made the statement that she believes the president should have the authority to raise the debt ceiling whenever he wants. Now, first of all finances have to go through Congress. As the minority leader in the House and former Speaker of the House, Nancy knows that that's one of the biggest parts of her job is controlling monetary issues as far as the government. If it has anything to do with the budget, like the debt ceiling or the fiscal cliff, that's primarily their responsibility. For her to say the president should have that. It's akin to when Ruth Bader Ginsburg, just a few years back, made the statement. Of course, she didn't do it locally. It was on an international interview. But she made the statement. She's a Supreme Court justice, for those of you who aren't aware. Made the statement that the Constitution of the United States is no longer a relevant document in our modern age. Even though every last bit of authority, every last bit of whatever makes her worth being part of our government comes from the Constitution. Her entire job is to determine whether or not other laws that are passed meet the constitutional requirements. If the Constitution is no longer a viable and relevant document, well, then the Supreme Court's no longer relevant. Basically saying, why pay any attention to me? It's the same kind of logic that liberals tried to use, pointing out Australia as an example of gun control laws. Since the Australian gun ban, armed robberies are up 69%. Assaults with guns are up 28%. Gun murders are up 19%. Home invasions are up 21%. Don't let those nasty little facts get in the way of a really good story you want to tell. Facts should never get in the way, right? Bottom line is, if the current occupier of the White House and Congress don't reach a compromise to avoid the so-called fiscal cliff, military is going to see a lot of budget cuts. The Defense Department is probably going to lose about $600 billion in cuts over the next decade. According to the nonprofit National Military Family Association, the cuts will be affecting family programs, healthcare, housing, and things of that nature. Military contractors are also going to be feeling the pinch, as a lot of contracts are just not going to be there, or they're going to have to go for a lot less. Now, on the upside, things in the budget like pay and retirement pay and the TRICARE for Life programs are not supposed to be touched. In the meanwhile, you have executives and CEOs from large companies that are going to have their hands tied and even trying to make budgets for the upcoming year because of the uncertainty about what the tax rates and the cuts in government spending are going to be. If your company happens to be a government contractor, you don't know what's going to happen as far as contracts that you were hoping to get or hoping to have renewed. You're going to have the expiration of the Bush-era tax cuts automatic for everybody if they don't actually reach a deal. But tax law needs to be in place for businesses to be able to budget and make decisions about hiring and other budgetary issues too, because they need to know what they're going to be facing on that end of it. If you can't pass freaking tax laws so that something good can happen, what are you left with? A lot of uncertainty, and uncertainty is bad for business, and it's also bad for the stock market, in case you missed the fact that it's down more than 400 points over the last 3 days of its opening, all because more and more information just wasn't available as far as where the fiscal cliff was headed. You're talking about roughly $2,000 in federal taxes being added to the average middle-class household. That breaks down to about $75 if you're one of these folks, $75 per check if you're one of these folks that gets paid every 2 weeks. And that's the majority of Americans. You're also talking about what really comes to that being withheld that they can't spend is nearly $200 billion less being spent in our economy. That's bad for business too, whether it's a large or a small business. It's bad for the economy, period. I mean, less folks are going to be hired. Less folks are going to be spending money. There's going to be less stuff to sell. And while prices are still going up, it makes everything harder. According to the chief White House correspondent for NBC, Chuck Todd, the biggest challenge in finding a compromise is the fact that the occupier and the other leadership in Congress, they're just not willing to own the entitlement reform. And the bottom line is, until somebody steps up and says,